Peace, peace to all my we in the house. Peace. You see the topic? The Freedman's bank theft heist amongst the people. Heist amongst the people. This is my fourth bull. This is my fourth time trying to connect y'all. Because in 1865, the prior video told you. I told you in the 1840s is when the courts passed a law that the banks could do what they do to this day. So we are definitely going to get into this. Get your pen, get your papers out, take your notes. You may have to re-listen to this video, but this is one of the most important videos. For everybody that is doing banking in a commercial bank today. On a summer morning in 1874, a man walked up to the doors of Freedman Savings Bank in Washington, District of Columbia. His hands trembled as he held his deposit book pages. Carefully preserved, inside that book was his entire future. 7 years of wages saved penny by penny, money earned as a free man working as a porter, a laborer determined to buy land for his family. He deposited $43. Not much to some, but to him, it was everything. It was freedom measured in coins. The doors were locked. A sign hung in the window, closed. No explanation, just that word that would echo through generations. The man stood there, staring at his reflection in the glass. Behind him, others began to gather. A woman who had saved to send her daughter to school. An elderly couple who had planned to buy a house, a church deacon whose congregation had pulled their resources, all holding deposit books, all locked out, all about to discover that 3 million had vanished. 61,000 depositors, 9 years of hope destroyed in a single calculated betrayal. This is the story of the Freedmen's Bank and how white men in positions of power orchestrated one of the most devastating financial crimes in American history. The promise began with hope. March 3rd, 1865. The Civil War was ending. After 246 years of slavery, freedom was finally becoming real. The 13th Amendment was about to abolish slavery forever, but the abolitionists who had fought for freedom knew that liberation without economic independence was freedom in a name only. President Abraham Lincoln sat in his office that day holding a pen that would sign into law something unprecedented. The Freedman Savings and Trust Company, a bank created specifically for the 4 million people who had just freed from slavery, for men and women who had never owned anything, who had never seen their own wages, who had been property themselves. Now they would have a safe place to build wealth, or so they were told. The man behind this vision was John His last name is Alver. Alver, a congregational minister and abolitionist who had spent years watching newly freed people struggle with their first encounters with money. Just weeks earlier, on January 27th, 1865, Albert had gathered more than 20 philanthropists and businessmen in New York City. He painted a picture of what freedom truly required. Food and shelter were not enough. Education alone was not enough. To truly escape the shadow of slavery, Black Americans needed financial independence. They needed to save, to invest, to own land, to pass wealth to their children. But where could they safely keep their money when so many banks refused to serve them, and when swindlers lurked at every corner, ready to prey on their inexperience? Alver, Alver's solution was elegant: a savings bank chartered by Congress itself that would accept deposits only for formerly enslaved people and their descendants. The money would be invested in safe government securities, not risky loans, no speculation, just steady, secure growth. It encouraged saving and help build the economic foundation that freedom demanded. When Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts brought the bill before Congress on February the 13th, it passed quickly. There was confusion about where the bank would be located, whether just in Washington or across multiple states. But the vision was clear. This was the right thing to do, the moral thing, the necessary thing. When Lincoln signed the charter into law on March 3rd, 1865. He had no way of knowing it would be one of his final acts as president. 5 weeks later, on April 15th, he was dead. The bank he had authorized would carry his legacy, or so people believed. In the years to come, the bank would print his image on deposit books and advertisements. Lincoln's face became a symbol of trust, a promise that this institution had the backing of the federal government itself. But the promise was a lie. The bank was private. The government guaranteed nothing, and the men who would soon control it had very different plans than the ones Lincoln imagined. In its first year, the Freedmen's Bank opened its doors with genuine purpose. 2 military banks that had served Black soldiers during the Civil War. One in Norfolk, Virginia, and another in Beaufort, South Carolina, transferred their deposits to the new institution by January 1866. The headquarters had moved from its original New York location, and branches began opening across the South. Richmond, Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, Vicksburg, Houston, everywhere Black communities gathered. The bank followed between 1865 and 1866 alone. 19 branches opened in 12 states and the District of Columbia. John Alver, now serving as the bank's secretary and later as president, worked tirelessly to build trust in Black communities. He invited Black leaders to serve on local advisory boards, though they had no real power. He promoted the bank in churches and schools, agents of the Freedmen's Bureau, the government agency tasked with helping formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. Actively endorsed the institution. The message was consistent and powerful. This bank is safe. This bank is yours. This bank will help you rise. And Black Americans believed. They came with coins wrapped in handkerchiefs, with bills folded carefully in pockets, and wages earned as soldiers, as laborers, as domestic workers. Isn't that what's still going on today, my people? Most accounts held between $5 and $50. To wealthy men, these were trivial sums. But to people who had owned nothing, who had been owned themselves, these deposits represented something profound. Hope, dignity, a future. The bank grew with astonishing speed. By 1870, Black Americans had deposited more than 12 million, worth approximately 292 million in today's money. 30 branches stretched across the mid-Atlantic and the South. The Freedmen's Bank had become one of the first multi-state banks in America, rivaling institutions that served the wealthiest white citizens. At its peak in early 1870s, the bank held assets worth 3.7 million, over 80 million in market value. Success seemed certain. The dream seemed real. But beneath the surface, something dark was growing. In 1867, something shifted. The headquarters moved from New York to Washington, District of Columbia, the center of political power. With that move came changes in leadership. New trustees joined the board. Men with different priorities, different connections, different morals. The original 50 board members had all been white men, philanthropists, and businessmen who were supposed to oversee the bank's operations with integrity and care. But the charter Congress had approved contained fatal flaws. It required no security from the trustees, no bond guaranteeing their faithful service, no personal liability if they failed in their duties, or worse, if they actively harmed the institution. Some trustees barely participated in bank business. Some attended no meetings at all. Some even denied they had agreed to serve on the board in the first place. The structure was broken from the beginning, built on the assumption that wealthy white men would act with honor. Simply because Honor was expected, but honor without accountability is merely suggestion, and suggestion, as the depositors would learn, carry no weight when money is at stake. As long as the bank simply held deposits in a safe government bonds, as long as it functioned exactly as the charter prescribed, the flaws remained invisible. But flaws don't disappear. They wait, and in 1867, the men who would exploit those flaws began to arrive. Then came the man who would orchestrate the systematic theft, Henry David Cook. Henry David Cook. Look the name up. Do your own research. Do your due diligence. Born November 23rd, 1825, in Sandusky, Ohio, Henry was the younger brother of J. Cook. He would become the most powerful financier in post-Civil War. Now, Cook County is where all the Moors put in their nationalities, Cook County in Chicago. Now, according to this research, Henry David Cook. Cook is the last name. So, does Cook County, has the Moors just re-registered themselves back into slavery under the bankers and a charter in Cook County? Something to make you think about. J. Cook, who would become the most powerful financier in the post-Civil War America, J. Cook had founded the first investment bank in the United States. J. Cook and Company, an institution that had helped finance the Union War effort by selling millions of dollars in government bonds to ordinary citizens. He was trusted by presidents, respected by senators, seen as a patriot who had used his financial genius to save the nation, and Henry, his brother, carried that reputation like a shield while wielding it like a weapon. In 1862, J. Cook had opened a Washington branch of his investment bank, placing Henry in charge of operations in the nation's capital through political connections and shrewd maneuvering. Henry quickly became president of the First National Bank of Washington, essentially the local office of J. Cook and Company. He also secured the presidency of the Washington and Georgetown Street Railroad Company, giving him control over the city's transportation. His political connections ran deep. He financed elections. He cultivated relationships with powerful Republicans. He understood how Washington worked, how influence followed, how money and power circulated in visible but predictable patterns. In February 1871, President Ulysses Grant, President Ulysses Grant, the general who had won the Civil War, appointed Henry Cook as the first territorial governor of the District of Columbia. Henry was everywhere now, a spider at the center of multiple webs. He controlled banking. He controlled transportation. He controlled political appointments. When he joined the board of Freedman's Bank, likely in the late 1860s, he didn't see a moral mission. He saw an opportunity. He saw deposits flowing in from people who had no political power. You have no political power when you deposit your investments into any commercial bank. They are the custodian, they are the conservators, they are the trustees, they own the property. You don't own your bank deposit anymore after it's deposited into a commercial bank. He saw deposits flowing in from people who had no political power, no legal sophistication, no ability to fight back. That is why you have to put a trust down at the county clerk. He saw money that could be moved, redirected, used to serve his interests and the interests of his brother's empire. He saw a charter with no enforcement mechanisms, no real oversight, no consequences for trustees who betrayed their duties. Henry Cook quickly positioned himself as a chairman of the bank's finance committee, the single most important position for someone planning to loot an institution. From that role, he controlled where deposits went, how they were invested, who received loans, and which companies the bank did business with. His first move was subtle but devastating in its implications. He began depositing large amounts of Freedman's bank cash into his own First National Bank. So why would you use a First National Bank knowing the history now? Why would you want to deposit anything into a commercial bank knowing this history that you can look up? This history is on the record. These weren't small transfers. Began depositing large amounts in Freedman's bank's cash into his own First National Bank. These weren't small transfers. At its highest point, 500,000 of Black people's savings sat in Henry Cook's personal banking operation, earning him 5% interest. And that's what they're still doing today. Meanwhile, the Freedman's Bank promised its depositors 6% returns on their savings. The math was simple and brutal. Henry Cook was using other people's money to enrich himself while promising returns that couldn't be delivered. That's what the banks are doing today, all the commercial banks. He was paying depositors 6% on money that was only earning 5%. The difference had to come from somewhere. It came from the principal. And who's the principal? The people. You, the depositor, is the principal. From the depositors themselves. So here, the difference had to come from somewhere. It came from the principal, from the depositors themselves, from the actual savings that families had entrusted to the bank. Every month, this arrangement continued. The bank grew weaker. Every month, Henry Cook and his brother grew richer. And every month, the depositors moved closer to the ruin without knowing it, trusting that their money was safe because the bank looked solid, because it bore Congress's charter, because Abraham Lincoln's face appeared on the deposit books. But Henry Cook wanted more than just quiet, steady theft. Henry Cook was a thief who set up a bank, Freedman's Bank. Okay? The Freedman's Bank charter had been written with strict protections precisely because the founders understood the temptation that large deposits would create. 2/3 of all deposits had to be invested in safe United States government securities. bonds backed by the full faith and credit of the federal government. The remaining third be held in reserve or invested conservatively and critically. No loans were allowed at all. None. The bank was designated to be a fortress, impenetrable to the kind of corruption that had destroyed so many other banks that served vulnerable populations. These rules stood directly in the way of Henry Cook's plans, so he decided change the rules. Henry Cook was not a man who accepted obstacles. He was a lobbyist, a political operator, a man who understood that in Washington rules were negotiable for those with the right connections. He began meeting with members of Congress, explaining that the Freedmen's Bank charter was too restrictive, that it prevented the bank from serving its depositors effectively, that it limited the bank's ability to help Black Americans across credit, that it limited the bank's ability to help Black Americans access credit for homes and businesses. He made it sound noble. He made it sound like he was advocating for the very people he planned to rob. And they're still robbing you to this day in all commercial banks and private banks and the Treasury. And Congress, influenced by his reputation, his connections, and his apparent good intentions, listened. On May 2nd, 1870, Congress amended the Freedmen's Bank charter. The change seemed technical, a matter of financial regulation rather than moral catastrophe. But it was the moment when the bank transformed from a protected institution into a feeding barrel for corrupt trustees. The Freedman Savings and Trust Company could now make commercial loans. It could invest in real estate. It could speculate in corporate bonds and railroad securities because it stole the people's rights. The people had no more banking rights. They didn't have a trust. Nothing was protected. The bank was the trustee, and the trustee is the owner of the property. So every time you deposit your money into any commercial bank, just say goodbye to it. It could speculate in corporate bonds and railroad securities. The bank that had been built as a conservative savings institution became authorized to operate as a commercial bank, taking on all the risks that commercial banking entailed, but without any of the oversight or expertise that commercial banks required. Almost immediately, the money began flowing out in new directions. Henry Cook and his associates on the board made loans to themselves. There you go, my people. I'm going to repeat it. Henry Cook and his associates on the board made loans to themselves, to their friends, to their family members, to their business partners. They invested heavily in Washington real estate during a temporary boom fueled by massive, unsustainable government spending on public works projects. The banks stole everybody's money, lent it to themselves, lent it out to everybody they knew, anybody that all depositors lost their money. It's getting ready to happen again. Massive, okay, they brought bonds in the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroad. So you may want to go look that up because that's where some of your money is sitting. They just transferred the names into different company names. So they bought bonds in the Union Pacific. That's a company back then. Central Pacific Railroads. That's another company of the railroads. Even though such investments violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the amended charter, they loaned money to construction companies and quarries and real estate speculators, accepting collateral that was worth far less than the loans, or sometimes accepting no real collateral at all. The most egregious, um, gregarious theft involved the bank's new building, a monument to deception, dressed in brownstone and marble in the early 1870s as deposits poured in from across the South and Mid-Atlantic as branch offices multiplied and the bank's operation expanded. The trustees decided they needed headquarters that matched the scale of their supposed success. More than that, they wanted a building that would inspire confidence, that would make depositors feel they were part of something permanent and powerful. They chose a location that would have been impossible to improve upon for symbolic value: Lafayette Square. You may want to write that down. Lafayette Square. Go do your due diligence on that. Directly across from Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House, on the southeast corner where the square met. Madison Place. The site screamed legitimacy, authority, government backing. From that address, you could almost see in it the president's windows. The Treasury building stood nearby. The most important banks in the capital surrounded the area. This was the financial and political heart of the nation. If the Freedmen's Bank was located here among the institutions that controlled billions of dollars and shaped national policy, surely it must be as secure as they were. This was the message the trustees wanted to send. That was the lie they wanted depositors to believe. And it's the same lie that they have you believing to this day in 2026. The building itself would be designed to overwhelm. Plans call for a 6-story brownstone structure in the latest architectural style. The facade would feature rows of tall windows, letting light pour into the banking halls. The entrance would be flanked by imposing columns. Inside, high ceilings would create a sense of grandeur and space. Marble floors would click beneath the feet of depositors. But what y'all don't know is that the bank, this infrastructure that they're saying that they built, it was already built. They just moved in to a building that was built by our forefathers and ancestors from Siberia and beyond. Okay, marble floors would click beneath the feet of depositors. Brass fixtures would gleam under gas lamps and later electric lights. They didn't have any money. They stole the money. So why would they reinvest money to build a building that would have all of these the precious minerals and metals of the earth. My people, you have been told a lie. Everything about the design spoke of permanence, strength, and trustworthiness. It comes from beyond Tartaria, beyond Siberia. Construction began in the early 1870s. The final cost would reach 260,000, equivalent to more than 7 million in today's money, for an institution that served people depositing $5 to $50 at a time. This was an almost incomprehensible expense. That shit is a fucking lie. You know this is a lie because they burnt the records and then they rewrote history. The entire point of the Freedman's Bank was to serve the poorest, most vulnerable population in America. Now that's true. Where do rich people go to make their money? Poor people. Because the poor people are the richest people and the most ignorant. Yet here were the trustees spending equivalent of 52,000 depositors' entire life savings on a single building, a building that was already erected. All they did was move into a building that they found. The irony was lost on no one who understood what was really happening. But to the depositors, the people who walked past the magnificent structure or who heard about it from friends and family, the building proved the bank was legitimate. Only strong, well-managed institution could afford such grandeur. Construction contracts, of course, went to friends. So every time you deposit your money into one of these commercial banks, they're lending it out to their friends, to themselves. It's not to you. Banks don't supposed to be able to lend money, but they do. Robert Fleming, a contractor with ties to Henry Cook's network, received loans totaling $224,000 from the Freedman's Bank to complete the work. Think about that structure for a moment. The bank was essentially paying its own building twice. Once through legitimate construction contracts and again through loans to the contractor that would never be repaid. Fleming would pocket the loan money, complete the work using the bank's direct payments, and walk away with double compensation. This is what they've been doing, my people. It was a perfect closed loop of corruption, money flowing out of depositors' accounts and into the pockets of white businessmen who understood exactly how to exploit an institution. With no real oversight, by 1873, the building was complete. It stood proudly on Lafayette Square, its brownstone gleaming, its windows reflecting the White House across the street. When the bank moved its headquarters into this new space, even the most skeptical observers had to admit it looked impressive. The Freedman's Bank had arrived. It looked like it belonged among the power centers of the republic. So it was a republic. Even back then, it was a republic. And that appearance was exactly what the trustees needed to keep the deposits flowing while they drained the resources dry. Frederick Douglass, the most famous Black man in America, visited the new headquarters shortly after it opened. Douglass had been asked to serve as a trustee years earlier and had reluctantly agreed, though his involvement had been minimal. He lived in Rochester, New York at the time and rarely attended board meetings. But he knew about the bank. He had followed its growth with interest. He believed in its mission. When he finally saw the building and the person, the impact was overwhelming. Douglas later wrote about the reaction with prose that captured both his awe and, with hindsight, his tragic misunderstanding of what the building truly represented. The whole thing was beautiful. He wrote, I had read of this bank when I lived in Rochester, New York, and had indeed been solicited to become one of its trustees and had reluctantly consented to do so. But when I came to Washington and saw its magnificent brownstone front, its towering height, its perfect appointments, and the fine display it made in the transaction of its businesses, I felt like the Queen of Sheba. When she saw the riches of Solomon, that half had not been told me. The Queen of Sheba had visited King Solomon and been astonished by the wealth that exceeded all reports. She had heard Douglas use that biblical reference deliberately. He was saying that the reality of the Freedman's Bank surpassed anything he had imagined. He saw elegantly dressed black clerks behind the counters, men in fine suits, conducting business with dignity in a space that revived any white institution. He saw depositors being treated with respect, their transactions handled with the same care that white banks gave to wealthy clients. He saw, or thought he saw, proof that Black Americans could build and maintain institutions of economic power. What Douglas didn't see, what he couldn't see from the beautiful facade and the busy banking floor, was the books upstairs. They never show you the books, my people. He didn't know about the 500,000 sitting in Henry Cook's bank. He didn't know about the loans to the Seneca Sandstone Company. He didn't know about the railroad bonds that violated the charter. He didn't know about Robert Fleming's 224,000. He didn't know that the magnificent building he was admiring had been paid for twice over with the stolen money. He didn't know that the institution was already insolvent. They were already bankrupt in the 1800s. And they're still bankrupt to this day. Okay, he didn't know that the institution was already insolvent, that it was keeping afloat only by using new deposits to pay obligations. The depositors are us, we the people, and we're paying the public debt every time we deposit money into a commercial bank. And they still don't pay the public debt off. They said deposits to pay old obligations. The obligation is old as fuck, my people. The classic structure of a financial fraud. So when you see on your 1099-B obligations of the Treasury, these are the obligations of the Treasury. Anybody that has a birth certificate in the 50 states, the Treasury has an obligation because it has the serial number on the birth certificate. The serial number is tied to the SSA administration, which is tied to an SSN, which is tied to the Board of Health. The classic structure of financial fraud. Frederick Douglass looked at the Freedman's Bank headquarters and saw a dream fulfilled. He too was lied to. The trustees looked at the same building and saw a useful tool for maintaining confidence just a little longer, extracting just a little more money before the inevitable collapse. And they're doing the same thing right now in 2026. And the depositors, Black families of 17 states, looked at the building when they heard descriptions of it and believed their savings were as sold as the brownstone facade. They were all wrong. The building was beautiful, yes, but it was a beautiful lie. Then came the catalyst that would expose everything and bring the entire fraudulent structure crashing down. September the 18th, 1873, a date that would echo through American economic history. On that day, J. Cook and Company, the most trusted financial institution in the United States, the bank that had financed the Union victory in the Civil War, the firm that presidents consulted and sentences courted, declared bankruptcy. So they stole every depositor's money. The announcement sent shock waves through every financial market in America and Europe. Jay Cook had built his empire on government bonds during the Civil War, convincing ordinary citizens to invest in Union victory. So, what if Chase Manhattan declares bankruptcy? Do you know how many people are going to be broke like a mofo? After the war ended, he sought new ventures, new opportunities to deploy. His financial genius, he founded the Northern Pacific Railroad, an ambitious that build project to build a transcontinental line from Lake Superior in Minnesota to Puget Sound in Washington Territory. The railroad would open vast territories to settlement and development. It would connect East and West. It would be glorious. It would also be a disaster. Remember, Chase was coming in. Chase was around there. Chase Bank. The Northern Pacific was plagued with problems from the start. The terrain was brutal. Tracks had to be laid through mountains, across rivers, through territories where winter temperatures dropped to minus 36 Fahrenheit. Engines sank into mud during spring thaws. Rails buckled in summer heat. Workers faced constant danger from accidents, weather, and conflicts with Native American tribes defending their ancestral lands from the invasion. So you had the American Indians, the Native American Indians, which is us, people in New York. We are Native American Indians. And you see that it was a constant fight. They were fighting to stop this bullshit from commercial bankers. And we're still in the same situation right the fuck now. Accidents, weather, and conflicts with the Native American tribes defending their ancestral lands from invasion. The Lakota, Sioux, and other nations had no interest in seeing their territory carved up by a railroad serving white settlers. They fought back. Railroad crews needed military protection to do their work. Course spiral far beyond projections. Jay Cook had sold bonds to thousands of investors, promising safe returns backed by the railroad's future profits, but there were no profits. There was only bleeding red ink and mounting debt when he couldn't raise enough capital to continue construction. When the bills came due and he couldn't pay them, when European investors who had been burned by other American railroad schemes refused to buy more bonds, Jay Cook's empire collapsed in a single September day. His firm closed its doors in Philadelphia first, and then New York, then Washington. Henry Cook, holding his position at First National Bank in Washington, fled the city the day before the collapse became public, rushing to his brother in Philadelphia. It all happened right here, my people, and it's getting ready to happen again. Either Chase is gonna fucking a public bankruptcy, TD Bank a public bankruptcy, Citibank a public bankruptcy. They're gonna do it again. But there was nothing either of them could do. The firm that had seemed invincible was finished, and with it, a large portion of the Freedman Bank's assets vanished. Remember, Henry Cook had deposited 500,000 of the Freedman's Bank deposits into Jay Cook's First National Bank. So, do your due diligence. First National Bank, the ones that still exist today, are part of Jay Cook's, the Cooks. And they're the ones that have the ancestral wealth, the First National Bank. Cook's First National Bank. He had also pushed the bank to invest in Northern Public Railroad bonds, the very securities that proved worthless when the railroad failed. The Freedmen's Bank had loaned money directly to Jay Cook and adequate collateral. When Jay Cook fell, he pulled the Freedmen's Bank down with him. But Jay Cook's failure did more than destroy those direct connections. It triggered what became known as the Panic in 1873. What became known as the Panic of 1873, a financial crisis that swept across the United States and inevitably the world within days of Jay Cook's collapse. Other banks began to fail. The New York Stock Exchange, unstable to handle the panic, selling, closed for 10 days. So in the 1800s, the stock exchange was there also. The first time it had ever shut down in response to an economic crisis. Business across the country couldn't get credit. Factories closed. Workers lost their jobs. The economy spiraled into a depression that would last for years. For the Freedmen's Bank, the panic was catastrophic. Depositors who heard about bank failures began to panic themselves. They rushed to branches demanding their money, a run on the bank. In Washington, in Richmond, in Charleston, in New Orleans, frightened people lined up outside Freedman Bank offices, clutching their deposit books, desperate to withdraw their savings before it was too late. And the bank couldn't pay them. There simply wasn't enough cash. The money was gone. Loaned to failed companies, invested in worthless railroad bonds, deposited in Jay Cook's collapsed bank. Spent on a building that looked solid but protected nothing. By early 1874, the situation was desperate. The bank couldn't meet withdrawal requests. Branches were running out of cash. Trust was evaporating. The white trustees knew the end was near, so they made one final calculated move. They would install a black president. If the bank was going to fail, they wanted a black face to take the blame. In March 1874, with the bank hemorrhaging deposits and branches running out of cash, with angry depositors demanding answers, and the trustees finally facing the reality they had created, the board made one final calculated move. They disposed John Alver, the white minister who had founded the bank 9 years earlier. Alver had presided over the institution's transformation from noble mission to corrupt complicity. Either way, he had failed. The trustees needed a new face, a new strategy, a new way to buy time. They offered the presidency to Frederick Douglass. The decision was brilliant in its cynicism. Some historians some historians studying the motives behind this appointment believe the trustees wanted a scapegoat, someone they could point to after the inevitable collapse and say, see, this is what happens when you let Black people run financial institutions. The appointment would confirm every racist stereotype about Black incompetency, every claim that freedom had been a mistake, every argument that white control was necessary for any institution to function. Other historians take slightly more charitable view, suggesting the trustees generally hoped that Douglas' reputation might restore confidence among Black depositors long enough for the bank to survive the crisis and stabilize. Maybe with Douglas at the helm, people would stop withdrawing their money. Maybe the panic would subside. Either way, whether the appointment was cynical or desperate, the trustees were using him. Douglas respected and admired throughout Black America as the voice of abolition, freedom, the living symbol of resistance to slavery, the most famous Black man in the nation. Had no experience in banking. He didn't know how to read a balance sheet. So they say. He had never managed a financial institution. He had no idea how to keep the corruption ran or how to completely the bank had been hollowed out. But trustees knew he would bring something more valuable than expertise. He would bring trust. His name alone might stabilize the situation. Douglas was approached with urgency. The trustees explained that the bank faced temporary difficulties due to the national financial crisis. They said the panic of 1873 had hurt all banks, that the Freedmen's Bank simply needed stronger leadership to weather the storm. They appealed to his sense of duty, his commitment to Black economic advancement, his desire to see the Freedmen's Bank succeed in its original mission. They likely didn't mention the 500,000 in Henry Cook's failed bank. They probably glossed over the worthless railroad bonds and uncollectible loans to friends. They certainly didn't explain that they had spent years systematically looting the deposits. Douglas, despite his brilliance, despite his decades of fighting for justice, despite his ability to see through white lies, about slavery and inequality, believed them, or at least he believed the bank could be saved. He believed in the mission. He believed that Black Americans needed this institution. He may have had doubts. He was too smart not to have doubts. But he set those doubts aside and accepted the presidency in late March 1874. Frederick Douglass became the face of the Freedmen's Bank. When Douglass finally gained access to the bank's complete financial records, when he sat down with the ledgers and saw the full scope of what had been done, he was horrified. The bank wasn't facing temporary difficulties, the bank was already dead. The treasury is already dead. There's no money in the treasury, y'all. They already moved whatever money was in the treasury, it's gone. Years of fraud had hollowed it out so completely that there was nothing left to save. Assets that appeared on paper as loans turned out to be uncollectible. Companies listed as borrowers had gone bankrupt and never existed. Real estate held as collateral was worth a fraction of the loans it supposedly secured. The numbers didn't add up because they had never been meant to add. The trustees had been running a theft operation disguised as a bank. And now they had handed the corpse to Frederick Douglass and asked him to resurrect a corpse. Douglass later described the experience with characteristic directness, taking the presidency, he wrote, was like being married to a corpse. The institution looked like a bank. It had a building, branches, deposit books, official charters, but it was already dead. Killed by the men who had controlled it, and no amount of effort or good intentions could bring it back to life. Still, Douglass tried. He was not a man who gave up easily. He had fought slavery. He had survived as a fugitive. He had built himself into a voice that commanded respect from presidents and changed national policy. If anyone could save this institution, if anyone could find a way through this disaster, surely he could. Douglass invested $10,000 of his own money into the bank, a huge sum, nearly half his annual income. He hoped that the injection of capital might stabilize the situation, might provide enough cash to meet withdrawal demands while Congress investigated and perhaps authorized a bailout. He gave speeches reassuring depositors. He met with branch managers and tried to coordinate responses to the crisis. He worked with what energy and intelligence he had to save the bank. But it wasn't nearly enough. The losses were too vast. The theft had been too complete. The crisis had spread too far. The bank had promised depositors nearly 3 million. It had only tens of thousands in actual cash. The gap was unbridgeable. Douglass appealed to Congress for help. He explained the situation to the senators and the representatives, hoping the government might intervene to protect depositors who had been encouraged to trust the bank by that same government. Congress held hearings, controllers examined the books, reports were written documenting the fraud, but no bailout came. White Southern congressmen, many of them former Confederates or Confederate sympathizers, saw no reason to use federal money to reimburse Black depositors because y'all didn't have a trust. Y'all didn't have a trust on file. You had no standing in law. You were calling yourselves Black. You did not do any status corrections. Y'all probably didn't even know about status corrections. If anything, they viewed the bank's failure as proof that Reconstruction had been a mistake. that Black Americans weren't ready for economic independence, that white control should be restored throughout the South. Northern congressmen, even the sympathetic to Black rights, were reluctant to set precedent of bailing out private banks that had been mismanaged if they saved the Freedmen's Bank. Wouldn't they have to save every failed bank? Where would it end? On June 20th, 1874, Congress passed legislation authorizing the closure of Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company. The bill appointed commissioners to liquidate the bank's remaining assets and distribute whatever could be recovered to depositors 9 days later. On June 29th, the bank's trustees met one final time. They discussed whether there might be any way to keep the institution alive, any possibility of reorganization or rescue. They finally admitted what Douglas had discovered months earlier: the bank was beyond saving. They voted to shut it down immediately. Some historical sources cite July 2nd, 1874, as the formal closure date when the commissioners officially took control. Either way, the result was the same. After 9 years of operation, after collecting deposits from more than 61,000 people, after promising security and hope and a path to economic independence, the Freedmen's Bank closed its doors forever. Branches across 17 states shut down within days. Signs appeared in windows: closed. No more deposits, no more withdrawals, just silence and locked doors and deposit books that had become worthless paper. 61,144. Depositors learned, some immediately and some over the following weeks as news spread through communities, that they had lost almost everything they had saved. Now, when you look through some of these communities, drive through some of these communities, you see a lot of Chase banks are closed. Is Chase Bank getting ready to do the same thing that Freedmen's Bank had did? Is Chase Bank, because it's probably run by the same motherfuckers? Chase Bank can declare bankruptcy and it's a wrap. Everybody has lost everything from Chase Bank. The final accounting was devastating. The bank owed $2,993,79068 million. It had 31,000 in cash. Everything else was tied up in uncollectible loans and worthless investments in Washington District of Columbia. Alone, more than 3,000 depositors, both individuals and cultural institutions like churches and mutual aid societies. So, District of Columbia is a foreign entity right here in the United States. This tells you a lot, my people. Individuals and cultural institutions like churches and mutual aid societies lost their savings. Across 17 states, families who had saved for years to buy land, to start businesses, to educate their children, found themselves right back where they had started. Worse, actually, because now they had lost not just money, but trust. Congress appointed commissioners to liquidate the bank's remaining assets and distribute whatever could be recovered. Between 1875 and 1883, commissioners issued dividend payments. To claim their share, depositors had to submit their bank books and prove ownership or legal heirship. Airship, they're saying AIRSHIP. So depositors had to submit their bank books and prove ownership or legal heirship. So if you never kept your own book ledger about your bank that you what you was doing, bam, you ain't getting shit. If you didn't have ownership to show ownership from the bank papers that you kept, you ain't getting shit. And if you couldn't show legal heirship, you just you lost everything. Many couldn't. Bank books had been lost, people had moved or passed away. Record keeping was incomplete. Time limits exclude many who learned about dividends too late. In the end, only half of all depositors received any money. Only a third received all dividends owed. Most recovered between 50 and 62% if they got anything. Many got nothing. The impact rippled through generations. In October 1937, 60 years after the collapse, Mrs. J.B. Metz from Clarksburg, West Virginia, wrote to the President Franklin Roosevelt. The Great Depression had hit Black families hard, and Miss Metz was desperate. She had a book, she had a bank book showing deposits by her mother and grandmother Susan and Katie Murphy between May 2nd, 1871 and June 7th, 1873. The last balance was $9,628. She asked if there was any way to recover the money. The response came from a clerk in the office of the controller of the currency. Brief and final, no assets remained. Nothing could be done. Stories like hers played out across the country. Families discovered ancestors who had deposited money that should have been passed down, building wealth and opportunity. Instead, it had been stolen by men whose names appeared on no deposit slips, who faced no criminal charges, who walked away wealthy, while those they betrayed struggled to survive. For decades, account holders and their descendants campaigned for the federal government to assume responsibility. They argued correctly that the bank's advertisements had implied government backing. Lincoln's image on the deposit books endorsed from Freedman's bank bureau agents, the prominent locations across from the White House, everything about the bank had suggested it was safe, official, protected, but Congress had never granted the deposits. And when the bank failed, Congress refused to pay what was owed. Between 1882 and 1920, numerous bills were introduced proposing federal reimbursement. Congress is for their United States. It's not for you. That's their Congress. Their Congress can do anything over you if you allow and accept it until you create your own government system. Congress had never granted the deposits, and when the bank failed, Congress refused to pay what was owed. Between 1882 and 1920, numerous bills were introduced proposing federal reimbursement. Several presidents expressed support, but white Southern congressmen blocked every attempt. In 1927, the United States Treasury announced that remaining assets from the bank's liquidation were depleted. They took over the Treasury also. And that's what's going on today. There's no money in the Treasury. Every time that you're trying to get something out that is a Treasury obligation, is why you get back IRS notices. We need 60 more days. We need 90 more days because there's no money in the treasury. There's no money at fucking all. They have hijacked everything. The money that you work for, that you earn, is through your labor. They hijack your labor. And I did that yesterday's live, which you need to go listen to. No further refunds would be ever, no further funds would ever be available. In 1939, a depositor named Henry Thomas wrote to the NAACP asking them to lobby Congress for the remaining 38% that had never been paid. He wrote, I tried to get my senator to introduce a bill, but it went nowhere. The government that had encouraged Black Americans to trust the bank. You don't trust commercial banks. You are your own fucking bank. The government that had failed to oversee it. The government that had allowed white trustees to steal with impunity refused to make the victims whole. The psychological damage was as deep as the financial loss. Historians argue that the failure of the Freedmen's Bank didn't just destroy savings, it destroyed trust. For generations, Black Americans viewed banks with suspicion. Why save money in an institution that could simply take it? Why believe in financial systems built and controlled by white people who had already proven they would steal? And it's not only white people. You got people of color that's going to steal from you too. So color don't matter here no more, y'all. The bank's collapse became a lesson passed down through families. Be careful. Don't trust them. They will betray you. W.E. Du Bois, the great scholar, the activist, wrote that the bank's failure not only ruined thousands of colored men, but taught thousands more a lesson of distrust, which it will take them years to unlearn. That distrust had real economic consequences. Wealth is built over generations. Parents save and pass resources to children. Children use those resources for education, businesses, property. Each generation builds on what came before. But the Freedmen's Bank stole that foundation. The 61,000 depositors were families, communities, churches, mutual aid societies. Their collective 3 million should have become land ownership, business capital, college tuition, inheritance. Instead, it vanished into the pockets of Henry Cook and men like the racial wealth gap today. The vast disparity between white and Black household wealth has many causes, but the Freedmen's Bank robbery is one of them. And what happened to the men who orchestrated the theft? Henry Cook was never prosecuted. Congressional investigations recommended indictments. The evidence was overwhelming, but no charges were filed. When Jay Cook and company failed, Henry Cook resigned as territorial governor and moved in with his daughter's family. Okay? He moved in with his daughter's family to escape. He died in 1881. He never paid back a cent. He never faced a courtroom. The other trustees followed similar paths. Most simply, moved on. The legal structure protected them. The charter required no personal liability. So they created their own charters. They wrote in. They had no liability. They could do anything they want. Have you read Chase Bank's charter? Have you read the banking commercial charter in your state? Your money is not safe. This story right here is from the 1800s, 1865. They were hijacked. Not only did they get hijacked, but the bank was right across the street from the Treasury. So they moved and then they hijacked the Treasury after that. The legal structure protected them. The charter required no personal liability. They could not loot the institution and walk away because the law let them. And the law was written by men like them. Frederick Douglass bore the emotional weight. Long after he wrote this, his connection to the bank brought upon my head an amount of abuse and distraction and detraction greater than any encountered in any other part of my life. People who didn't understand the timeline blamed him for the failure. It wasn't true. Douglass had been deceived like the depositors, but he carried the strain, but he carried the stain away. The building on Lafayette Square, the magnificent brownstone that had convinced Frederick Douglass the bank was strong, stood as a monument to the betrayal for decades. So you could go down into Washington, D.C. and look at all of this history. Some of it might not even be there no more. Some of it might still be there. In 1882, 8 years after the bank's closure, the federal government purchased it. The federal government purchased it. That means they own the fucking treasury that's connected to the fucking IRS today. My people, wake the fuck up. The site sat empty until World War I. When the Treasury Department needed additional office space, architect Case Gilbert designated a new building in the Beaux-Arts style completed. In 1919, it was called the Treasury Annex, a bland name for a bland building. For nearly a century, no marker explained what had stood there before. The history was buried, forgotten, erased. Then in 2015, advocates began pushing to acknowledge the truth. The Freedman's Bank had an important chapter in American history, one that needed to be remembered, not hidden. The Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland held panels commemorating the 150th anniversary of the bank's charter. Historians published new research. Dissidents of depositors shared their family stories. The movement grew. On January 7th, 2016, Treasury Secretary Jacob Lew announced that Treasury Annex would be renamed the Freedman Bank Building. My niggas, my people, the Treasury and the Freedman's Bank, this is the connection. They are robbing us blind. There's no money in the fucking Treasury. The research is telling you this. Go and research this shit for your fucking self. And all the fucking tax returns that we're probably doing, they're stealing them. A ceremony was held. Former Atlanta mayor and civil rights leader Andrew Young spoke about the bank's legacy. The building finally officially acknowledged the institution it had replaced and the people who had been betrayed there. The records that survive tell remarkable stories. 20 branches of the Freedman's Bank left behind, registers of depositors that are now held at the National Archives. These registers contain detailed personal information that is extraordinarily valuable for geological research, names and ages, birthplaces and residence, occupations, names of parents, spouses, children, brothers, sisters, sometimes the names of former enslavers, physical descriptions, in an era when records of Black families were rare, when enslaved people's lives went largely undocumented. These signature books are treasures. They capture a moment when people were transitioning from slavery to freedom, when they were building new identities. And that's what status correction is about: new identities, new families, new futures. The depositors who signed those books believed they were securing their economic future. So when they folded, this is some deep shit. They didn't know they were creating an archive that would matter far more than the money. They lost today. The story of the Freedman's Bank is a story about trust, power, and betrayal. It's about how systems can be designed to help, but corrupted to harm. It's about how good intentions mean nothing when accountability is absent. It's about how racism operates not just through violence or exclusion, but through theft disguised as benevolence. The white men who founded the bank may have had noble goals. John Alver generally wanted to help formerly enslaved people build wealth. But when other white men, men with power and connections, had no moral restraints, took control, the institution became a weapon. The depositors had no power to stop them. They weren't on the board. They couldn't vote out corrupt trustees. Well, you can put a Form 56 on these corrupt trustees now and a UCC lien. You can publish it in a fucking newspaper about the corruption. They couldn't access the books to see where their money was going. They could only trust that the trust was betrayed. The Freedman's Bank failed in 1874, but its legacy lives in the wealth that was stolen, in the opportunities that disappeared, in the trusts that died. When we talk about why racial wealth gaps exist, when we ask why Black families have less generational wealth than white families, this is part of the answer. 3 million stolen from 61,000 people, dreams destroyed, futures erased, all because white men in positions of power chose greed over honor, theft over stewardship, lies over truth. They chose greed over honor, theft over stewardship, lies over truth. This is the real story of the Freedman's Bank. Not America's first Black bank, but America's most devastating betrayal of Black economic hope. There's no such thing as hope. You have to pave the way for yourself. So, if Chase Bank ever goes under, look back at the Freedman Bank story. Freedman's Bank is now the Treasury that sits in the District of Columbia. We are being heisted once again. You have heard it straight from the United States, private enterprise free state, in on the check on, always giving you the most updated information with historical facts, and that is what the research has shown. So, 407-300-5377. If you need consultations, we have the consultations, $25 for a consultation for 25 minutes, my people. Big up to all my people in the chat. Big up, Sing. Big up to Sing. Big up to Wen Cole. Big up, big up, big up to Wesley. Big up. How y'all doing out there? I just dropped the Willie Bow on y'all. Would be nice for a donation. Cash App the donation to capital R, lowercase UBIE, uppercase W, lowercase ILKIE, $ RUBIEWILK. Peace to all my people. Stay up, stay one, stay strong, and remember, the commercial banks are robbing you.